A lot of the time we associate ghost towns with remnants of long ago, history of a distant past when the world was a completely different place. But the reality is every year there's new ghost towns popping up for one reason or another. One of the newest, eeriest, and most fascinating of these ghost towns is Picher, Oklahoma. All that remains now is an overgrown street grid, a few buildings still standing, a number of building foundations, and large mounds of toxic mining tailings, which just so happened to be a big reason why the town was abandoned. In the first half of the 1900s, the tri-state area of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri was a prolific hub for lead and zinc mining. Picher, Oklahoma was right in the heart of this region. Mining in Picher started on a large scale around 1913 when a major discovery was made, and by the end of that decade, the town's population had exploded to almost 10,000. By this time, the Picher area mines were some of the best and most productive lead and zinc mines in the world. According to some sources, roughly half of all the lead and zinc used in World War I was extracted from the Picher area. In the mid-1920s, Picher would reach what was its peak population at just under 15,000. By this time, the town was thriving, with all the infrastructure and supporting businesses required to handle such a population. It even had a well-developed trolley system to help mine workers commute in and out of town. But like all mines and mining towns, the area eventually began to decline. New sources would spring up in other areas, and the most accessible materials in Picher started to dry up. The decline of mining in Picher began in the late 1920s and would continue for the next several decades. By 1930, the population was already down to half of what it was at its peak, and by 1950, it was down under 4,000. Mining in Picher would officially end in the late 1960s, at which time the town was in pretty rough shape. The population was a fraction of what it once was, but more significant was the damage left behind by decades of intense mining. As many as 14,000 abandoned mine shafts were scattered around the town, and over 100 million tons of tailings and other mining byproducts were piled up. Shallow mines also contributed to some major issues with sinkholes, cave-ins, and unstable building foundations, which further complicated things for the residents of Picher. Although it wasn't fully understood initially, the real downfall of Picher was the toxins that were left behind from the mining operations. Massive piles of tailings known as chat were piled up around the perimeter of the town. These had high levels of heavy metals, not surprisingly including lead, and were spread easily when the wind would blow. And before the danger was fully understood, there was even reports that kids would play in the piles like a sandbox, which unfortunately further subjected them to the toxins and heavy metals. Additionally, subsurface operations caused significant contamination of the area's groundwater. In the early 1980s, the Picher area was added to the Tar Creek Superfund site, an acknowledgement by the government that the area was highly polluted and needed significant remediation. Testing in the early 1990s showed that 1/3 of the children tested had dangerously elevated levels of lead in their blood. Not long after, the EPA and the state of Oklahoma decided to do a mandatory evacuation of the town. Residents were being relocated, and by 2000, the population was down below 2,000. Then, in 2008, a serious tornado struck what was left of the town, which was essentially the finishing blow for the town. Buildings that were destroyed by the tornado were not rebuilt, and by 2010, the town only had 20 residents left. The final resident of Picher passed away in 2015, making it a true ghost town, one of the most recent to achieve such a status. Nearby towns of Zinkville, Carden, and Hockerville also met similar ends, albeit at a much smaller scale than Picher. The remediation of the site is still ongoing despite the town not having any residents anymore. Some of the chat is being repurposed to be used in the production of construction materials. Most of the buildings in the area have been demolished, although some still do remain. I was surprised when I was passing through there the amount of activity on the roads. It was mostly trucks hauling material, I'm assuming as part of the remediation efforts, but the roads were surprisingly busy despite the area's eerie post-apocalyptic feel. It was fascinating to drive around the old town, but the reality is that there's not that much you can see at this point. Most of the buildings that once stood are no longer standing, and a lot of places were off limits. So what I think might be more impactful to do is to do a quick tour via Google Street View, and this will allow us to see both The modern day town, or what it looks like, I think most of the street view imagery is from 2024, along with what it looked like 15 years ago, back in 2008 to 2010. In doing this, we can really see how quickly the town cleared out and see kind of the before and after right at the end of the town's life. So right now we're above Picher, Oklahoma, and the first thing you can see that's very blatantly obvious, the impact that the mining had on the area. You can see all these piles and mines and all that kind of stuff, so that's kind of interesting. But anyways, on to the street view tour. This is coming down the main road. So this right here is kind of the main strip coming up US Route 69. If we go back in time, you don't have to go back that far for it to really look like a completely different place. This is 2008, and you can see there's kind of what's left of a main street. Although by 2008, the town was starting to clear out pretty substantially, but as you can see, big difference between now, this was August 2024, and 2008. And this is like this pretty much anywhere you go. Most of the places aren't standing, and a lot of these roads are actually off limits now. Things have been piled up at the entrances, so the Google Street View car was probably one of the last ones to get through here. But this is going back to 2008 again. You can see pretty thriving little neighborhood, and you can see the chat piles in the background. And then we skip ahead to 2024, and there's nothing there. Let's just look at a few other places along the way. This over here is near the high school. And once again, you can see there is a baseball field, some athletic facilities, and now there's nothing there. Looking the other way down the street, same kind of thing. You can see houses, you can see the chat piles in the background. And then it's hard to even recognize, but you can still see that there's chat piles in the background. So it's just interesting to see how quickly everything changed for the town of Picher. It's one of those situations where it had been trending in that direction for decades, but it's the last little bit is when the major changes are noticeable. Let's just look at a few other places. Down here is where the bulk of the tornado came through. Again, this is what it looks like now. A lot of these roads have been blocked off, so it's cool that we have the opportunity to look at the Google Street View. And then this is going back to 2008. Completely different looking. But again, you still got the chat piles in the background. This actually gives us a couple dates, so 2023, 2024, and then later in 24. I'll just pick one or two other random places. One place where there actually is still buildings standing is up here. I'm not sure why these buildings were left, but this is still what it looks like even today. This street view is from 2024, but when I drove by, these buildings were still here. But if you go back to 2008, they were all lived in and occupied. And then skip ahead to close to modern day, and they're obviously not lived in, not occupied, and they don't want people going in them. A lot of them had keep out signs all over them and that sort of thing. So if the toxic materials everywhere, the looming threat of cave-ins, the contaminated drinking water, and scenery that would look at home in a war zone, if that wasn't creepy enough, there's one other story that solidifies Picher as one of the most unsettling and creepy places in America. In 1999, there was a horrifying, high-profile crime that happened in the nearby town of Welsh, Oklahoma. 2 adults were found killed in a house that had been set on fire. Their high school-aged daughter and one of her friends were also missing. They've never been found, but there's some suspicion that they may have been dumped in the abandoned Picher mines. The man who was ultimately charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder pled guilty to 4 counts of accessory to murder and received a 10-year prison sentence. In 2023, he was released after only 38 months as a result of his good behavior while in prison. Thanks for watching. For next week's video, I'm kind of continuing with this theme of toxic waste and how it can shape and transform our cities, with a look at the St. Louis area and how large sections of it were totally transformed by toxic waste disposal sites. Most significantly, the disposal of toxic waste associated with the Manhattan Project. So if you're interested in catching that or just want to help support the channel, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it.